a talk by one of our postdocs, Dr. Phillipa Haine, who is a counselling psychologist in a postdoc in our department and has research interests predominantly in enhancing mental health care and um, quality within this country. So, as a contract lecturer, she teaches and supervises research at undergraduate and postgraduate level. And Phillipa also manages a private practice, predominantly working from a CBT based approach. And Phillipa currently sits as the vice chair for the South African Association of Counselling Psychology. Phillipa, thank you very much for taking the time to present to the colloquium this afternoon, and we are very much looking forward to your talk. Um, Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for the introduction. I hope you can see me, hear me, see my presentation. We had a bit of a sound issue earlier, so Bronwyn, please let me know if it happens
Yes,
again.
yes,
Thank
I
you.
can see you, hear you, and if I could just kindly ask colleagues to please mute themselves. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, great. So as Bronwyn said, my name is Phillipa Haine, and I'm a registered counselling psychologist and also a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch University. And I was actually thinking back, what a surreal moment this is for me, because as an honors student, I started attending this colloquium each week. And so to be on the flip side now, I'm presenting my research, it feels like a full circle moment. So thank you again. So some of you might be aware that I presented this data at a workshop earlier this year, and it was on behalf of the Division of Counselling Psychology for SISA, and it was quite amazing. We actually had a turnout of between 300 and 400 people, which was record breaking according to SISA, and I think it really just speaks to the interest in this topic, but also the uncertainty, feelings of disillusionment that have sort of plagued the profession since 2011 when the scopes of practice were promulgated and sort of the scope wars that entailed after that. So I really hope that this research can set a foundation for moving forward and effectively utilizing counseling psychologists, because they are a valuable resource and workforce in our country, that currently the data showing that we are not utilizing um, effectively or optimally. There we go. And so, as I mentioned, I presented this data earlier this year, and we had 90 minutes together at that point. And I realized we're probably going to have about 45 today. So, I'm only going to be speaking to you about the first two aspects, which is the scoping review, which sets the foundation for this research, and then the quantitative aspect of the research. So starting off with the scoping review, we have got a paper on this if you would be interested in reading up more on the details of it. And you can have a look on the screen, carry on. But ultimately, we had two aims with the scoping review. The first was to map or collate all of the information that was available on the counselling psychology workforce in South Africa. And the second was to look for papers that had been written about from a career stage or lifespan perspective. So you might be asking, why focus on psychologists from a career stage or lifespan perspective? And that is because as psychologists progress in their careers, their needs and challenges change. So what the literature is showing us that early career psychologists are actually quite vulnerable, where in the entire lifespan, they have the highest attrition rates, where it's the largest number of psychologists leaving the profession. And that could be from a number of challenges, where securing employment, financial challenges from student debt, finding a work-life balance, etc., etc. And the early career psychologists have actually been shown to experience higher rates of burnout, as well compared to more established psychologists, and decreased career satisfaction. And the American Psychological Association, so the APA, have defined the different career stages as early career being 10 or less years of experience since graduation, mid-career being 10 to 20, and then late career being more than 20 years of experience in the field. And in this study, because we were interested in focusing on early career psychologists, we actually collapsed the mid and late career stages, and we labeled it, we named it established career psychologists. So why focus on early career psychologists as well? Well, they have kind of high levels of energy and enthusiasm. They have fresh ideas, and they also have the latest skills and knowledge in the field. So we need to really look after them, but also they are the leaders, the future leaders of the profession. And then just a note on why focus on counseling psychologists specifically. And I think just a note, in my master's year, I looked at a small sample of clinical and counseling psychologists, specifically early career, and their experiences, even though there was some overlap, they were quite different. And what I was quite surprised about was the very, very limited literature available on the counseling psychologist workforce specifically. And so that's what prompted me to then pursue my PhD specifically on counseling psychologists as a category, but then also early career counseling psychologists because they're particularly vulnerable in the professional lifespan. So review, the aim of a scoping review is to summarize or identify gaps in the literature, and it's often a precursor to a systematic review, where systematic reviews were required to answer specific questions, whereas a scoping review is often used when there's less knowledge on the field, and so we map or understand where the gaps are, and then we follow up with a systematic review. Right, so I don't want to get too bogged down in the scoping review itself. Again, you can read up on this in your own time, but just a quick note, the inclusion criteria is that all the studies had to have been conducted in the new millennium, so between 2000 and 2021. It needed to be peer-reviewed, it needed to be contextually relevant to South Africa, and then provide a direct linkage to the counselling psychology category, so the counselling psychology workforce in South Africa. And here is a summary of what we found. And ultimately, there were 10 peer-reviewed papers that were included in the scoping review. And here we can see the authors and the year, the aim of each study, the design, the sample that was used, and whether or not a career stage or lifespan perspective was utilized. And to me, this was quite shocking. There were only 10 papers in the last 21 years that have focused on the counselling psychology workforce. Again, there were a number of interesting findings from the scoping review, but just to highlight a few, 8 out of 10 of these articles were published in the last decade. So since 2011, when the scope wars started, we think this is what sort of prompted the increase in research on the profession. And then 6 out of 10 of those articles were not based on primary empirical data. So this is where we ended up realizing the majority of the papers were actually commentaries or reviews. And the studies that did have empirical or kind of samples that they used were not representative of the total workforce. So, for example, the largest sample was 228 counselling psychologists, which represented about 12 to 13% of the entire population. So think at present there's about 1,800 registered counselling psychologists in South Africa. And so what we gained from this, there were 6 main critiques, and providing us with the direction forward, that there were small sample sizes, and so our study looked to recruit a more nationally representative sample of counselling psychologists. There were limited uses of qualitative designs, so the voices of counselling psychologists weren't coming through. Counselling psychologists were being spoken about in all the commentaries and reviews, but they were never sort of included in the research. There were limited longitudinal designs, so tracking the changes in the workforce over time was not a focus. There was domination by a small number of authors. So Professor Charles Young, who was my primary supervisor for my PhD, he actually authored 50%, so 5 out of 10 of the articles that we found. So there was a need for more diverse authors speaking on the profession. And then there were multiple analyses on the same set of data. So I mentioned the 228 sample size that was used. 2 sets of studies that were quantitative used the same sets of data, and so there was a regurgitation of the data rather than fresh data coming in. And then again, I mentioned predominantly reviews and commentaries. So hence we kind of started with our study, and it was a mixed method sequential explanatory design, which ultimately involved a quantitative phase with surveys with counselling psychologists in South Africa, and this was then followed by interviews with individual counselling psychologists. Again, this is a paper that we published, and you're welcome to go and have a look at it if you're interested in more details around the quantitative section. But this is what I'm going to be focusing on presenting to you today. So the objective, the aim of this section was to examine the workforce trends of early career counselling psychologists and established counselling psychologists in South Africa. So to compare the 2 groups, and then to investigate were there similarities and differences between these 2 groups. So the latest group that have graduated compared to those who graduated more than 10 years ago. And then to assess the demographic profiles for insights into transformation. Is there change? Are there trends that we're seeing? Are there differences? So in terms of the method, we managed to recruit 512 HPCSA registered counselling psychologists, which was fantastic considering that the second largest sample ever to have been recruited was almost, I think, a third of that. And 40% represented early career and around 60% represented more established. As I mentioned, we used a survey questionnaire that measured a number of different sort of demographic characteristics, as well as work setting, career satisfaction, etc. How we managed to go about this, and we were very lucky in this sense, is that just before the PUPPY Act was implemented, we were able to access a full list of email addresses from the HPCSA database, and we invited ultimately all the counselling psychologists that were registered to participate in the study. However, we found that a number of email addresses bounced. I think it was about 300 that were inaccurate on the system, and so we actually used snowball sampling, so putting the link on Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups of counselling psychologists to encourage participation. We did ensure that only one response from each IP address, so that there was not sort of multiple responses from the same counselling psychologist. And then, of course, we gained ethical clearance for the study. So there were a number of interesting results. The first is that we found significant differences in the demographic profiles of the 2 groups. And specifically, we found significant differences for age, race, geographic practice location, highest degree acquired, and then languages spoken. So starting off with gender, we found a major gender imbalance in both groups, where the majority of both groups of counseling psychologists were represented by women. In terms of race, this was an interesting one, where there is some transformation showing in the data where established counseling psychologists, there were 84% represented by white individuals compared to 59 in the latest cohort. And in terms of geography, they're almost near evenly distributed for the established counseling psychologists between Gauteng and the Western Cape, whereas early career psychologists were predominantly found in Gauteng. And we sort of attributed this to more opportunities, perhaps being available in Gauteng. We also predicted that it could be something to do with the fact that the Western Cape has no longer, I don't think they're running any of their counseling psychology programs any longer. So I know Stellenbosch, UCT, UWC, and that's for a number of reasons that the programs have been shut. Western Cape is one of the only provinces where the counseling psychology programs outnumber the clinical psychology program. So that was explaining that. And then age, obviously understandable. Early career psychologists were younger at 37 on average and established at 55. 44% of early career counseling psychologists could speak a language other than English or Afrikaans, which was great finding compared to only 19% of established counseling psychologists. And then 9% of early career psychologists held a PhD compared to 25 or a quarter of established counseling psychologists. Then in terms of work settings, so we actually asked a question because this has been quite a contentious issue where, or perhaps I'll start off with the majority, unsurprisingly, of both early career and established counseling psychologists were found to be in private practice. And so we had a follow-up question because we predicted this might be the case of how the likelihood, had you actually applied for jobs outside of private practice? And 80% of early career psychologists had said they had applied for outside of private practice sort of employment opportunities, but were ultimately unsuccessful, and that resulted in them starting their private practice, compared to only 36% of established counseling psychologists. And we wondered if this could be sort of where the early career or the latest cohorts are realizing the need to move beyond the therapy space or move beyond the individual focus into the communities, into, for example, public health, NGOs, correctional facilities, etc. Again, interestingly, the second largest group of early career counseling psychologists were found in university student counseling centers. And we thought this possibly could be where majority of counseling psychologists conduct their or complete their internships in student counseling centers. And so they probably are absorbed after the internship, and that would explain that high number there. And then both groups were found that the majority to be in urban areas. So interestingly, again, both groups, the majority, said that they did engage in supervision practices, but only on an as-needed basis. So this suggested that even though they were committed to supervision, it wasn't as regular, on a regular basis as we would hope. And also, interestingly, Early career psychologists, the majority engaged in formal, paid-for individual supervision, whereas established counseling psychologists predominantly engaged in informal, non-paid peer supervision. So what this tells us is that individual counseling psychologists who are early career are relying on seeking out and paying for their supervision services, which is surprising considering that financial challenges is a huge concern for early career psychologists. And then with established kind of relying more on their networks, their peers, more informal networks for supervision. Going back to the very first point, so this is again perhaps a contentious issue following the 2011 sort of idiosyncratic scopes of practice, is that 2/3 of both groups suggested that they engaged with moderate levels of psychopathology on a daily basis. So I think the insinuation from the scopes of practice in 2011 was that counseling psychologists were reduced to working with sort of high functioning mild psychopathology in clients, but this is suggesting that counseling psychologists are working with moderate levels of psychopathology on a daily basis. Right, we also looked at career satisfaction levels, and overall there was really high dissatisfaction by both groups. That being said, early career psychologists were significantly less satisfied than more established psychologists in terms of their income, their primary work setting, the employment opportunities available to them, and then also their work-life balance. That being said, both groups were equally satisfied with their choice in their career, which I will explain in a little bit, or why we think that is the case because of the follow-up interview data. Both were equally dissatisfied with the support they received as an early career psychologist, and what was meant by this was in terms of support from the HPCSA or from SISA, so professional organizations. And in the follow-up interviews, interestingly, the only aspects of support that counseling psychologists received were self-sought means of support. So engaging in therapy, engaging in supervision, and making an effort to network, unless they found themselves in a group private practice setting. So that was quite significant. 50% almost of both groups suggested they would rather choose clinical psychology if they had the opportunity to start over again, which was quite disheartening. And then 67% of early career psychologists said that in the next 5 years, they would consider immigrating. And again, in the follow-up interviews, they explained this as because there was limited employment opportunities or recognition, incorporation of counseling psychology outside of private practice settings in South Africa. So what did we gain from the quantitative section? The first was that a large proportion of counseling psychologists are early career, and so we need to continue focusing on this vulnerable group, and that there is a positive trend in demographic diversity among early career counseling psychology, but the transformation is slow, and we explained this by only a small number of counseling psychologists are trained each year, and so understandably the change in the profession would be slow. There's a major gender imbalance, and this is not aligned with the country's gender distribution, which is I think just over 50-50, and there's obviously clustering in urban areas, and this contradicts government's efforts to decentralize services, so into rural areas, and to improve access to previously marginalized communities as well. So the finding that the majority of counseling psychologists were quite satisfied in their career, despite all of these challenges and aspects that they were concerned with, is that the work itself, being a counseling psychologist, is very fulfilling. The work is meaningful, the work is altruistic, and that for many of the counseling psychologists in their interviews balanced out the category related challenges. And then, so again, the findings show that there's a major underutilization and poor distribution of counseling psychologists, where 80% were willing, they wanted to try and work outside of private practice, but they just couldn't secure work. There was a sort of a prioritization towards clinical psychologists, especially in state facilities. And then in schools, for example, educational psychologists were prioritized. And we suggested that this could be rectifiable through the creation of posts, because counseling psychologists offer something quite different. Our focus on prevention, social justice issues, strengths-based work. We could absolutely contribute in multidisciplinary teams in different settings. The alternative is, for example, in Australia. So Charles Young, who was my supervisor, has subsequently immigrated to Australia, but he was explaining their system of, even though the majority of counseling psychologists in Australia are based in private practice, it's the only other country that mirrors our workforce trends in that sense. The government in Australia subsidize the counseling psychologists in private practice so that the public can access those services in private. And then the last aspect is really to improve support for early career counseling psychologists, where they feel very unsupported in that transition from trainee, from student into independent professional, where in training there's an abundance of supervision and support. But how do we ensure that bridge to finding employment, setting up a private practice, marketing yourself, where we have mentors, etc. So I'm just going to stop it there because I know I've spoken a lot so far. Let's see, perhaps, Bronwyn, if there's any feedback or comments or questions, and then I can always go on if need be.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Philippa. We do have a question from Professor Kaponga in the comments, who asks how many counseling psychologists are registered with the HCSA, and would you have an estimate from your work on how many there are in South Africa today?
Okay, so currently there's about 1,800 registered with the HPCSA, and within South immigrated and are still registered. I'm just wondering, because there are a number that remain registered but are not necessarily working in South Africa.
Thanks, Philippa. Yeah, thank you. That was the only comment that we have so far. Thanks, Philippa.
All right, thanks, Bronwyn. Thank you. So perhaps, to speak to our sample size, our sample represented about 30% of the total population, which was great compared to the 12 or 13% in previous studies. Perhaps I can speak to the qualitative data then. So these were the follow-up interviews that were conducted, and again, this is a paper that we published based on this data. You're welcome to go and have a look at it. The details. But ultimately, the aim of the qualitative section was to explore the professional experiences of early career counseling psychologists with a focus on their challenges and support needs. So to have their voices come through, what are they struggling with? What do they need help with? Um, what are their experiences and meaning do they make of those experiences? And so we had a sample of 10 counseling psychologists, and they had to be registered uh, for the first time with HPCSA between 2010 and 2020. And that was to ensure that they fell within the 10-year definition by the APA. And then we engaged in semi-structured interviews, and these interviews lasted between 60 to 90 minutes. And how the participants were recruited is that there was at the end of the survey that invited participants to leave their email address if they were interested in being interviewed. And we actually, I think, sure, we had maybe 100 emails, which is speaking again to counseling psychologists wanting their voices to be heard and share their experiences. And it was so unfortunate that we were sort of restricted to 10. And we were restricted to 10 because of resources and time, but also because of the methodology that we chose, which was interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA, which focuses on smaller sample sizes, more in-depth understanding of meaning making of experiences. And then again, the ethics was approved. So this is a summary table of our participants who were included, and you can see the majority were white, female, mid-30 English-speaking counseling psychologists who were working in private practice. And this is quite in alignment with the demographic data that we found with the quantitative section, so the first phase. And so really, we thought this was quite representative, even though this was by chance. Perhaps I can explain how the participants were recruited, because we had over 100. We just decided that the first 10 participants who had sent us so the 100 we had email addresses for. We sent out an email then inviting them to the follow-up uh, process, and then the first 10 to respond to us, we then selected for the interviews. So just speaking to the findings, we had 3 major themes that was revealed from the data. And the first was the complexity of finding and securing work. And this is speaking more broadly, but obviously the participants really struggled to find employment. They didn't feel ready, and not in terms of skills, but in terms of marketing themselves, setting up a private practice. Where do they apply for jobs? How do they apply for jobs? And then coming without a sense of professional disillusionment. So what they had expected for their career, working in, for example, community settings, NGOs, correctional facilities, etc., and then what the reality was for them, sort of being pushed to enter private practice. And then what they did find was inadvertently kind of entering private practice, that there were advantages. So being able to manage burnout because they were their own boss, they were able to set their hours, their rates, etc., to a certain extent. And so they realized that private practice actually wasn't as bad as well, not as bad, but it even though it hadn't been their first choice, they were quite happy to then stay in private practice. And another aspect is how long it takes to get a private practice going, to build it up. It's a business, to gain a full clientele. And of course, many psychologists wouldn't want to just let this go. The second major theme was navigating an array of challenges, and this was at the personal, professional, but also at the systemic level. So, for example, grappling with professional identity conflict. And this was interesting, where the majority of the counseling psychologists who were interviewed had mentioned that their primary um, interest in the profession was entering clinical psychology. And when it came to applying for a master's program to increase their chances of getting accepted, they had ticked sort of the counseling box as well, not sort of knowing really what that meant, and then kind of counseling psychology choosing them. I think that was one of the quotes. So that was interesting. Then the sense of subordination in the profession, the public as well, general health community, not understanding the role of counseling psychologists, struggling with financial challenges. So those counseling psychologists who were able to work in community settings or in alternate settings really struggled to have an income that they were able to live off. So, and again, that sort of pushed them into their decision to head into private practice, where even though the clientele kind of comes in waves, and that's not predictable either, the money was better considering their student loans, etc., and the time investment they put into the profession and getting where they were. Work-life balance demands. So many of the early career psychologists, the phase that they were in was in their personal lives, sort of getting married, having children, buying a house, and how trying to establish themselves professionally and personally sort of had reciprocal effects on both aspects. Another interesting aspect was that many of the early career psychologists actually graduated just before or during COVID-19. And what this meant for them was that establishing a private practice or finding work, etc., was especially difficult. And so the majority found that process very slow as well. But they did note the transition to online sort of service provision was quite beneficial in terms of finances, where the outlay, all they needed was a laptop or a cell phone, and they didn't have to then pay rent or etc. etc. They could be in the comfort of their homes providing services. And then again, just speaking to immigration, that the majority explained that they would immigrate because of the lack or the limited work opportunities available to counseling psychologists, but also the hierarchy in the profession, and then some political and safety concerns. The final theme revolved around self-acquiring support. So as we found in the quantitative findings, the majority of the counseling psychologists did not feel well supported in the early stages of their career. And so the exception was entering group private practices where they felt that there were more established psychologists who can mentor them and they could learn from. And so they relied on really self-initiated methods and engaging in personal therapy. Many early career psychologists felt that they learned the most about themselves and their therapy processes through their own therapy supervision, and then networking was also crucial. Networking was also crucial for those counseling psychologists who found that they were able to secure employment outside of private practice. So knowing someone, knowing a colleague, knowing a family friend who could sort of organize something, in a school, that was quite interesting. And then finally, there were significant challenges in obtaining individual and peer supervision. And this was mainly reported by the participants, was because more senior or more established counseling psychologists were so busy that it was difficult to find someone who was committed and who had the time to provide those supervision hours to them. Right. So I'm going to briefly go on to, okay, perhaps I'll see if there's any comments first, Bronwyn.
There was one additional comment from Prof. Ratele, who just noted, I see there's another one, that being single and child-free seemed to be popular amongst the psychologists that you spoke to in this group. And Marinus has a comment here that with the introduction of the National Health Bill in South Africa, how do you foresee this legislation affecting the field of counselling psychology, particularly in terms of job opportunities, integration into the public health system, and access to mental health services for underserved communities?
Thank you. So perhaps to speak to Manus's question, so it is a major concern where I think at present there's recently been a paper that was published where only I think clinical psychologists were considered part of the NHI what's been written up. And I think behalf of SASA, there was a letter of kind of complaint of there needs to be inclusion of other categories of psychologists. I don't know if that's been amended. I'm not sure if anyone else knows yet, but there is a concern about counselling psychologist inclusion.
Thank you, Phillipa.
Okay, thanks, Bronwyn. So perhaps just to speak to the recommendations and how I like to think is in terms of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So the individual being the practitioner in the middle, and then that practitioner within various systems. So it's not up to one system or to the individual, but each to for changes to happen and for the optimization of the profession. So, for example, individual counseling psychologists, I've really encouraged them to engage in critical self-reflection. So, become familiar on what it means to be a counseling psychologist, what it means to be an early career psychologist, what are the challenges, speak to supervisors, mentors, therapists, also engage in career assessments of their own. Counseling psychologists are sort of the pioneers in career assessment and vocational work, and yet I wonder how often we look back on our own journeys and kind of seek guidance in that sense. And then to capitalize on opportunities to gain employment and provide services. So research diverse pathways, speak with counseling psychologists who do have success stories, where they're working, how did they get there, be proactive, be an advocate for the counseling psychology profession. Another interesting finding that I perhaps didn't get to speak to was developing a niche area of interest really assisted many counseling psychologists to secure work or establish successful private practices. So rather than being a generalist, which is again interesting considering some of the HPCSA's what's the right word? Decision to move explore that option is that is not as useful to practitioners on the ground. So encouraging the practitioners to better manage their work-life balance and to decrease their workload and their levels of burnout as much as possible. And this is through following firm boundaries of work-life boundaries and engaging in self-care, reducing workloads where possible, and taking a break from the profession. This one was quite interesting where, again, I didn't get to speak to it, but in the qualitative interviews, many of the psychologists who reported that they had experienced burnout or depression or their own mental health challenges actually had to change or take a break from the profession completely. One mentioned she went into the wedding industry, another went and taught English overseas somewhere, another went into events planning. So you can see, I mean, not everyone has the luxury of that though, and I think that's where the concern comes in. And then seeking out support, I think that's important. Training programs, so at that level, to select and train more Black, male, and multilingual counselling psychologists. The academic curriculum needs a number of amendments, so introducing different modules, so perhaps a module on career development, how to find work, market yourself, a business private practice module. Also encouraging trainees to become members of professional organizations where that should and could possibly offer means of networking and mentorship. Also, I didn't mention about including telepsychology services and training, especially since COVID-19, as a means to increase accessibility to services in South Africa. This is perhaps a contentious one, but getting counselling psychologists to do a community service here, where it seems arbitrary that only clinical psychologists are required to do that. I understand budget constraints, but counselling psychologists absolutely have the skills to contribute in those settings. Networking and peer support, program structure. I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, we're hoping to actually write up a paper on these recommendations, which be easier to see. But professional organizations and HPCSA, so setting up some sort of mentorship or supervision program where an early career counseling psychologist is paired with a more established counseling psychologist, where they would have to then, outside of the internship for 2 years, engage in mandatory supervision. And then online resources, this is something, so Bronwyn mentioned that I'm the vice chair for the Division of Counselling Psychology with SISA. And this is something that I've really been trying to work on with Prof. Megan Campbell, who is our chair, and creating an online base where there's resources for counselling psychologists, for early career counselling psychologists, advertising employment opportunities, mentorship opportunities, a centralized list of different career pathways. So one of the things we asked counselling psychologists to do, and we've been doing at our workshops and meet and greets this year, is to encourage sharing of career experiences and stories, and how established and especially successful established counselling psychologists have got where they are today, to inspire but also mentor up and coming counselling psychologists. Okay, and then including early career counselling psychologists in leadership and governance, and conferences. So I know with the APA, so the American Psychological Association, they offer an early career psychologist boot camp where at the conference each year, early career psychologists can learn about how to establish a private practice, etc. Where currently there is a psychologist by the name of Nikki Abdinal, who some of you may be familiar with, but she offers workshops that psychologists would need to pay for, early career psychologists on starting out. And of course, psychologists who are coming from previously modernized backgrounds, that it should be freely accessible to all early career psychologists. We need to build an evidence base for the value and practice of counselling psychologists in diverse settings. So beyond the therapy room, we need to encourage counselling psychologists to be to advocate for their role and their inclusion in state-funded settings, and then also to encourage, finally, this is the last point, established counselling psychologists to reach out to the new generation and create those connections for mentorship and support. And that's where I'm going to end today, with this quote, which says, "The profession is only as strong as the links in our professional chain, which can be solid and numerous. So remember to reach back in turn, welcome and support the next generation of counselling psychologists." Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Phillipa. Thanks very much for that very good presentation and for highlighting quite a few concerns that you've shared about such a highly skilled workforce facing so many challenges. And I hope that that the work that you've done will be sort of a good basis from which to really advocate for counselling psychologists and their important role in the South African mental health care space. Colleagues, we have time maybe for one or two questions or comments. I've read those that have been in the chat so far. Is there anyone who would like to ask Phillipa a question or give her a comment? We have Kayleen saying, "Thank you for a great session, Phillipa."
Okay, thanks, Kayleen. Perhaps I can pose a question back to the audience. Sorry, I'm putting Prof. Romani on the spot, but I saw she published a paper with Miriam Sali on registered counsellors, where there were similar experiences of poor employment opportunities, etc., and integration into state facilities, etc. So I'm wondering if Rosanna, you might have a comment or like to share.
Hi, Phillipa. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, I think that there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of registered counselors and counseling psychologists. But at the same time, it still feels as though counseling psychologists have more opportunities available to them. And, you kind of feel like these other categories, if you're not clinical, you're sort of the stepsister in the psychology world over here. And there's probably a lot of that needs to be done to integrate all these different professions. And I think something that came out in our work also was that people don't know what a registered counsellor is, and I think similarly for you, they don't know the difference between clinical and counselling psychology and what the value is in counselling psychologists. And, this is probably something that needs to be highlighted more. But I'm sure that Megan Campbell and your team at CISA are working on that.
Thank you so much. Yes, we are, and I think, as I've said, it takes a team, it takes all of us to work on this from an individual level right through. But there are many overlaps in issues.
Now, Magnus is just highlighting in the comments that there's similar experiences for psychometrists as well. So I think it's an issue across the board, and maybe one for the board to deal with more seriously, and the HPCSA. So I don't see any other comments or questions, Phillipa. So with that, I would just like to thank you again for your time and for sharing with us this important work, and hopefully there will be some meaningful change in the future as a result. So good luck with this ongoing pursuit. And colleagues, thank you for your attendance this afternoon. Have a great week further, everybody.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks all. Okay. Bye.
Bye.